and I am delighted to be in conversation with the co-executive directors of AWID, Cindy Clark and Hakima Abbas. Welcome.
Thanks, Nana.
Thank you, Nana.
So this Facebook Live today is to share AWID's experiences of the co-executive director model. Lots of people ask us questions about how's it going? How's the co-executive model going? I know I personally get asked, how does it feel to have two bosses? And because we're a learning organization, we thought we would share what we're learning about co-executive models as well as shared leadership. And that's the reason we have this live conversation today. So for anybody who's watching us live, feel free to engage with us, ask us any questions you may have. If you have any comments or thoughts, please share that in the box below. And even if you watch this video later on after the live is over, please send us a question anyway, and we will do our best to come back to you. So I'm going to start by asking Cindy the first question. Cindy, how did AWID arrive at this decision to even contemplate a co-executive model?
Sure. Thanks, Nana. So there's actually a long history there that stretches beyond the idea of the model itself. And I think it was sparked by the prior executive director for AWID, Lydia Alpiset. And she really initiated an internal conversation around shared leadership. What does shared leadership mean? How do we practice it across the organization? How are staff at all different levels supported to take initiative, to take ownership of their work, to make decisions. And so we'd been having this ongoing conversation around shared leadership. When she went on parental leave, then it was an opportunity to actually explore a co-director model as one manifestation of that experiment around shared leadership. And so we had that experience while she was on leave of two people being interim co-directors. Then when Lydia was in conversation with the board, and I do want to mention that I think it's next week, Lydia and our organization consultant, Barbara Williams, did a paper on the whole transition process that really documents the stages of this journey. But as Lydia was speaking with the board about her own transition and possibilities for the next cycle of leadership at the ED level in AWID, they had an active conversation around how do we embed shared leadership within the process, and also how can we explore different models. And so the board asked our organizational consultant to do research into different kinds of models. One of them was co-EDs, but we also looked, and within the staff team, we were talking about other models as well. Could there be a 5-person team? You know, what do other models look like? Ultimately, the board decided that they wanted to pursue a co-ED model with 2 directors, but it was also helpful that they had quite a lot of clarity. They were clear that at least one, if there were going to be 2 co-EDs, they wanted at least one to come from within AWID, because they felt that history and knowledge would be important. They didn't want to bring in 2 folks completely new. But it was really from that process that this idea grew. And then, of course, Hakima and I decided to apply together, and we'll go on and on.
Yes, and I was at AWID when we started having these conversations about shared leadership, and when we did the call out for someone to apply internally for this opportunity. And I remember I hadn't even thought about the idea that 2 internal people might decide to put in a joint application. So it was super interesting for me when you and Hakima, Cindy, decided to apply jointly. So Hakima, this next question is for you. What did you already know about shared leadership before applying, and what made you want to apply for this particular role with Cindy?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Nana. I think it's important to state, and we say this all the time when we're talking about shared leadership within AWID, that horizontal leadership and models of shared leadership, collective leadership, have been part of like communities and social movements and feminist movements for a very long time. For centuries. These aren't really new ideas. And they're still being practiced deeply by these communities and by oppressed communities around the world in participatory democratic ways, anarchist movements, feminist movements, in horizontalist traditions. So the work that we're doing kind of as an NGO and as many NGOs are doing is really borrowing from this knowledge and this tradition. And sometimes that can work, and sometimes it can be a bit messy and not work so well. Because I think the structures of NGOs, the legal frameworks, the infrastructure have also been created and kind of forced into corporate structures, which are deeply hierarchical and not necessarily fit for purpose, fit for mission. So before Cindy and I decided to apply together, I had organized in horizontal and leaderful movement formations, and the idea of shared leadership wasn't new. But I also knew of NGOs who had done some experiments in this, like Inter Pares, who are based in Canada. I think many people will know them, but they have a really interesting model of co-managementization, and they use consensus-based decision-making. The APC, the Association for Progressive Communications, their women's rights program had two co-directors, I think the titles were. Now they have three, so that's a model. Frida, that AWID has worked really closely with, has been one of the lead organizations in figuring out how to do co-executive director models. And so the challenge was really in some way deepen shared leadership in what is a hierarchy. And as you said, Cindy and I decided to apply together because we'd worked for several years as part of the director team, along with Lydia, as Cindy mentioned, and Anatoly, and that we felt that we could work well together, having already developed that strong working relationship and understanding what we brought to the table, that we did bring different strengths, and because both of our inclinations collaboratively. I would also mention that the board of directors of AWID at the time, particularly the board chairman of Cunningham, also came from lots of traditions and indigenous communities and movements where this type of leadership was not unknown. And so it was really encouraging to have some of their thought process behind some of this work. And in the process of applying together, we also got to test out ways that it could work. Really being open with one another, about what happened in individual interviews, sharing our application materials with each other, and then eventually also ensuring that we had the same salary.
Money is indeed really political. So, Cindy, I'm coming back to you, and I think I'm going to ask the question that lots of people would really want to know the answer to. How has it really been like working with Hakima? What has worked really well? What's been a bit more challenging to figure out? Please spill the tea.
You know, this is going to be so disappointing because it's awesome, right? Like I love it. I feel really lucky. I feel lucky to be working in this model, but I feel lucky to be working in this model with Hakima as well. And I think, you know, some of the, you know, what makes it great. It's a hard role, right? When you're in the ED role, you kind of hold the accountability. You kind of have to make the call, the final decisions. So being in those tight, difficult moments together and really being able to think through it together. You know, I remember very concrete instances when we were making a difficult presentation or a pitch. And it's like, I'm so glad you're here and we can build this together and we can draw on our different perspectives and thinking. I think it also has been helpful and affirming as we get feedback from staff that it's working. You know, we had some questions in the beginning, like you said at the beginning, Nana, how's it going to be to have two bosses? Not that there aren't things that we can approve, but it seems to be working well for the organization. Like it's helping us get where we want to go. And, you know, and I appreciate that, that Hakima and I can laugh a lot together in the seriousness and the strain. Like we can have a good laugh. I think some of the challenges are about, you know, when we get it wrong, like when I get it wrong. And I just think because there's this personal dynamic, because there are two of us in this role, there are ways that I think we need to take care to not get played off of each other, right? So we have different opinions, we think differently, that's part of the richness. But we need to really know when it's important for us to have a unified voice and when it's really important and enriching to be able to say, well, I think this way and Hakima feels this way, and let's figure this out together. So I think that's part of the learning and the work that we're doing, but it's awesome.
And I can say that as a staff member of AWID, it's actually been really refreshing sometimes to have you say, well, I think this, and then Hakim will be like, I hear that, but I have a different opinion. So it's like, oh, okay, so you're not going to give me an answer. We need to figure this all out together,
Yeah.
And I think for me, that has been a surprise because I feel like that's been working quite well. And at the same time, I also recognize the moments where the two of you have one decision and it's like, phew,
Yeah.
thank goodness you've got this sorted.
I think if I could just build on that, what really strikes me is that in so many of the decisions that we make and the work that we do, there's not a right answer, right? There's not like the one way that it needs to get done. And as someone occupying this kind of role, I have to find that one answer. There are many answers and ways of doing it. And I feel like this really affirms that and helps us just sort of come to grips with the many possibilities and trying to find the best way forward.
That makes a lot of sense.
Also build on what Cindy was just saying, I think one of the things that we've learned to embrace is that difference of opinion and those different perspectives, the disagreements, maybe even sometimes the tensions, but moments are opportunities really for us to grow and learn, and opportunities to make whatever decisions come out of that much stronger. And I think that's been a journey, but it's something that we've also really valued and learned along the way.
And Hakima, this is the third year of being a co-executive director with Cindy. What do you know now that you didn't know before?
That's a really good question. What do I didn't know before? I think I know Cindy better, and I think that's really important in terms of two people coming into these types of roles, that it takes a while to get to know each other deeply, and to really understand kind of where each one of us is coming from. And then that understanding is not just the perspectives but the ways of working. What are people's entry points into the work? How do they see the world, and what does that mean about how they come into the and it's taken a while for us to also develop them together. And so I would also say people often ask us, as they're considering this model, kind of what advice would you give for two people doing this? One of the things is be really gentle with each other, and really gentle. And we soon realized that that wasn't sustainable or a good use of both of our time. And so we had to really roll back and think about how do we do this
Okay. I don't know if you can still hear me, but I kind of feel like I have lost audio. Oh, good, you can still hear me. All right, great. So before, as we were promoting this live, we did ask people to send in any questions they may have, and we had quite a number from people who follow us on Instagram. So I want to pose some of these questions to you, and I'm going to read them so I get them accurately. So we have a question from Kay Sania on Instagram, and she wants to know, and Cindy, I think I'll direct Kay Sania's questions to you. She wants to know if you have, and Hakim has already hinted at this, a strict division of your spheres or areas of responsibility. So is there one person who is solely responsible for financial management, for example, and another person, solely responsible for staff management? So Cindy, if you could speak or maybe explain how you divide work up, because
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of the questions that we most often get from people. And it's evolved, right? It's changed over time as we've experimented with different things. Something that I would say that was important from the outset, and the board was very clear on this, because a lot of times when you have a co-model. There's an internal and an external role, and the board was quite explicit with us that they weren't interested in us pursuing that option, that they wanted us both to kind of hold the role together and both be part of the external face of the organization as well as do the internal work. And I think we really agreed and embraced that as well. That said, as Hakima was saying, we're different people, we bring different strengths. So what we have done is each year now we do a co-ED work plan. And so that helps us determine, what are the places, where are the concrete programmatic processes or projects that I'll be most closely following or that Hakima will most closely follow. But we share certain key things. So in terms of the supervision of staff that report to us, we do that jointly because that's a really important opportunity for us to both kind of be part of those conversations and understand what's happening in those areas of work. In terms of organizational finances, we hold that jointly, and there may be specific projects within that we'll each take a different kind of leadership role on, but it's a shared responsibility, similar with resource mobilization. We hold that together, even if for certain funders, I'm more of the point person, and for others, Hakima is more of that point person. Similarly with the governance work and the work with our board of directors, that's such a critical role that we do that together. And so I think it's really been a learning process for us. And as Hakima was saying, early on, we were erring on the side of we're both doing it all, and then realizing that doesn't work so much. So now better defining that division of labor and communicating it so that staff and people understand who to go to for what.
Thanks for that, Cindy. Hakeem, I'm going to direct the next question that we had come in, and it's a multi-part question. It came from, I want to check out the name, Erin Kilbride, who works with Frontline Defenders. And she wants to know if you're open to sharing and speaking about your various intersecting identities that you bring to the position, and recognizing that comes with a lot of strengths, but it can also bring complications when it comes to sharing leadership. And so how do you negotiate issues of representation, both in terms of internal and external, but also determining who should be in which spaces when it comes to advocacy, decision making, and linked to that, it is a long question. She wants to know how you navigate power, privilege, and identity in leadership. So feel free to answer any bits that you remember, and I can go back and reiterate certain aspects of the question.
Yeah, that would be great. Nana, tell me if I'm answering the question. I think it's a really important question, and Cindy and I again get this question quite a bit around, and indeed we really bring different identities to the table. One of the things that I think was really important at the beginning of our working relationship was that we had conversations about that. What does it mean at AWID within the team internally? What does it mean externally? And really, we're able to talk about our experiences in the workplace and in the movement of these intersecting identities and be blunt about power and privilege and how that plays out. But what's also important, I think, is that it's not a one-time conversation. That's a continuous conversation. I don't think we could do it well together if we didn't continue to bring that to the table and really listen to each other, and make decisions then on what we think is strategic to advance the work and to advance the agenda based on that. I don't know, Nana, if you're able to see the chat, but we also have on the chat at the same time.
So I can't see the chat, but if you can see the chat, please go ahead and read out the question. Sorry, this is, co-leadership of the facilitation as well.
We're modeling it right here. Okay, so Sophia Arroyo has asked, how have you addressed responsibility? Did you divide the portfolio and what was the process? I think, Cindy, you answered some of that in terms of the division of labor, but Sophia did reiterate the question, how do you divide the portfolio? Shireen Essoff wrote, how do you manage co-leadership with the added layer of being largely a virtual work organization? if you'd like, Nana, I'd be happy to take that, because again, this is one of the questions that come a lot. Ruth Ashenege wrote that it's really exciting and a great idea to put forward meaning of shared leadership, and sends her best. And Celia Turner wrote, what sort of internal, but this is from her colleague Lame, internal work prepared AWID for this kind of leadership. I wonder how you move everyone along and build that political will internally.
Right, lots of interesting questions. So Hakim, I'm wondering if you can speak to how we do this virtually, and Celia, and sorry, Cindy, I wonder if you can respond to Celia's question around how you build the internal capacity to be able to do this in an organization like AWID. So Hakima, maybe answer the question about how do you do this virtually?
Uh-oh.
I can see Hakima moving her head now. And clearly this is some of the challenges of doing things virtually. You know, sometimes you have issues with technology or...
They have complex.
Oh.
Okay, Hakima, you're sounding like a robot to us. And this is something like we joke about, right? When we are on virtual calls, sometimes people have like, at some point in time, like bad connectivity. And so they go through this robotic sounding phase. We kind of persevere through it. Hakima, do you want to try again?
It looks like we lost her entirely now.
Okay, it's fine. I know Hakima will reconnect when she gets the chance.
Yeah.
So let's come back to you, Cindy, and if you could answer Celia's question about how do you build internal capacity to be able to do this kind of work and to be on this kind of shared leadership journey.
Yeah, I mean, and I would say definitely check out the piece that I mentioned that we'll be putting out next week by Lydia Albisset and Barbara Williams, because it talks quite a bit about the organizational moment for AWID and how we built toward the transition process. I think it helped that we've been having an ongoing conversation around shared leadership in the organization. What does that mean? So as I mentioned, we'd experimented with co-directors when the ED was on parental leave, but we also had co-managers for one of our programs. And we were saying it's not only about role sharing, right? But how do we build this more broadly? I think there'd been a really rich and active conversation within staff. We had a staff working group who was looking at some of the questions of our organizational structure as we were moving into a new strategic plan, and feeling that we needed to refine and update the structure to go along with that. So it was an active conversation around how do we build more horizontality into what is, by definition, given our legal framework, a hierarchical structure. And there was a very participatory process, quite concretely, around the leadership transition moment itself. So as Lydia was preparing to step down, as the recruitment process was happening, the board sought input from staff on that process. There was a staff town hall with Hakim and I as prospective candidates into that role. So people really had a chance, I think, to raise their concerns, to ask questions, and to offer opinions along the way in the process. And that was really important.
Thank you so much. And it looks like Hakima is back. Hakima, can you hear us clearly?
I can hear you clearly. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, you sound excellent. You sound excellent. So there was an earlier question which you kindly read out about how do we do this virtually? How do we do shared leadership virtually?
And right on cue, my connection dropped. It was perfect.
I know, right?
Well done.
It was all staged. But I was saying, yes, Shireen, that's indeed the kind of double layer of both virtual organization and co-leadership. At AWID, we've had many years now of working as a decentralized staff, and so we've got quite a few practices that we've embedded through the work, a lot of tools that we use, be it Slack for communication or Asana for our project management, those kinds of online tools. It does mean we have a lot of conversations, which is interesting. You would think that virtually it means you actually have less conversation, but it actually means you have more. And I think that's because you need to connect on things that in an office you might just turn around and say, hey, Nana, what happened there? Whereas here, you connect around virtual calls. So we do have regular calls. Cindy and I connect once a week. Every Monday, we connect for an hour at the start of Cindy's day. We also try to use the fact that we're in different locations and on different time zones to our advantage where we can. So Cindy's day starts after mine. I can respond to things before she comes in. She works beyond my time in the office, and then she can do things or respond to things. And if we can, we use that to our advantage. We also try to connect as a team at least once a year, budgets permitting, because it's quite expensive, but we try to bring all of us together to make sure that we have that connectivity and building that shared sense of direction for the organization.
Thank you so much for responding to those questions. Also wanted to encourage people who may be watching this Facebook Live to check out some of the existing resources we have on our website, which is www.awid.org. Cindy spoke about a shared leadership working committee that we once had, and a number of folks from that committee actually wrote an article sharing our experiences on shared leadership. So we'll include that as a link on this chat. And also for anybody who is really interested in learning some tips and techniques to how to make working virtual effective, at least according to me. I wrote an op-ed on the subject as well. So again, we'll share that link in the comments. So I'm going to come back to you, Cindy. For individuals who may be considering applying for a shared leadership role, or for organizations that may be looking to embark on this journey, what would be your advice to them?
I think it's a model that can really work. I know sometimes for organizations that haven't been working in this model, it's like, how do you do it? It is doable. So I offer a lot of encouragement. At the same time, I think it's important, and Hakima mentioned this earlier, I think it's really important to know someone. I don't know how it would have worked for me with someone that I didn't know. I'm sure it's possible, and I know people have done it, but I think part of what I feel works well between Hakima and I is the fact that we are different and can complement each other, and yet we have some core things in common that are part of what makes it work. So that sort of knowledge is really key to being able to pull this off. I think the other thing that's been really important, and we've been very fortunate in that there were institutional resources that enabled us to get coaching. And so Hakima and I were doing leadership coaching. We started out both with individual sessions and then with kind of joint sessions that helped us work through some important steps in the process. So I think as much as possible, if there can be some resources like that to support the model, because it does take time to figure out and find the groove. And I'm sure it's a little bit different for every organization and team and constellation of folks involved.
Thank you so much. Hakima, how about you? If you were to answer that same question from your own position, is there anything you'd like to add to what Cindy has already said?
I mean, one of the things that Cindy and I get asked a lot is if folks who come into this model need to also be friends from the start. And our answer is always that we make the distinction between the friendship and care. And that it's really important in this role together that you hold care for one another. And that doesn't mean, so friendship might be you spend weekends together, you know one another's partners, etc. Whereas the care is, do you feel supported by one another and encouraged and really to thrive in this role by the other person who's also sharing this role with you? And I think that's really important when you're coming into the role together.
That makes
and
a
I'm
lot
very
of
lucky
sense.
to have that.
Oh.
Likewise. And Nana, there's another question in the chat about if we think the model of co-leadership works for small organizations. I mean, I would say, so AWID has a staff of about 40 people, right? And so that's where we are at. And I've been in conversation with someone who's looking at it, and I think their staff are currently around 5 people. I know it can be hard resource-wise. So Hakima mentioned salary earlier on. It's not that there's one AD salary and we each get half, right? So we're each getting a salary. It can mean, depending on the context then, that the organization is spending more resources in that way. So I think it can work for small organizations, but it's true that it will take those resources, and how those roles then relate to the other staff in the organization will depend a lot on how it's structured and worked. So I think it can work, but I know there's some special considerations as well.
Thank you. Thank you for speaking to that. And I know we focused a lot on the co-executive model because we get questions about that. You've also spoken a little bit about shared leadership. But I wonder if you could speak a bit more about how AWID is practicing shared leadership beyond the co-executive model. Hakima, sorry, that's a question for you.
Great. Yeah, so one of the things when Cindy and I came into the role, we were really clear that we didn't want shared leadership to stop at the co-ED level, and that we wanted to make sure to deepen the practice of shared leadership throughout the organization. What that's meant is enabling kind of processes and structures that allow for people to take up leadership from wherever they sit in the. So as an example, we have project teams where different members of the team might take up leadership of a particular project. We've also been really focused on and concentrated on what it means to manage in a shared leadership kind of model. How do managers really encourage and enable staff and their team to be able to feel like they hold responsibility and ownership over the work that they're doing? And one of the things, as you mentioned, there was the shared leadership working group who documented some of those experiences and tried to have some kind of articulation of what we mean by shared leadership. Because we're not a horizontal organization, we are still structured in a hierarchy. And so that's been evolving. I think we still find snags, and we're also really cognizant of being a learning organization. So we have reflections twice a year. We sit back and try to learn from what we're hearing and change some of the processes that are needed to do that. Another thing I would just mention before I stop, Nana, is I think it's also important to look at policies with the shared leadership lens. How do policies enable people to do the best work from where they sit in the organization?
Thank you. I think I'm starting to see the comments now. I saw somebody expressing thanks for the political education, but I just want to make sure I haven't missed any other comments. Are there any new questions that have come up? Okay, because I'm coming to my final question, but just to say to anybody who may be watching this live or watching this later, like Cindy and Hakima have mentioned, we are a learning organization. Part of how we learn is really by being asked questions, by sharing our thoughts and our experiences, even whilst we're still learning and growing. So do feel free to send in any questions or comments even after this live has ended. So my final question, and it's the same question to both of you, is, are there any resources that help you in this job of being a co-executive director model? You've spoken a bit about coaching, about practice and care. Is there anything else that you'd like to share? Or can you share any other final thoughts you have on shared leadership? So same question to both of you, and I'll come to you first, Cindy.
I mean, it's definitely been helpful to be able to talk to other people in the model. So, we had conversations with the Frida co-EDs, or just folks that we meet along the way, whenever we find a co-director, it's like, oh, how do you do it? And, how are you dealing with this and that decision making? And how do you figure that out? And it can take a little longer. So I really appreciate the generosity from different folks to share and exchange. We eat up like all the blogs and the writing that other folks do. So that's part of the spirit behind this as well, is to keep sharing and expanding that conversation. Has been really helpful. I think I also want to give a shout out for just the staff goodwill and openness. Like I say, I think people were really open and generous, even with the questions at the start, and have been, it can be hard to give folks feedback and say, what are you doing? And this is taking too long and you need to figure this out. But I think I really appreciate the feedback that we get that helps us get better at what we do. That's been really important.
Thank you so much, Cindy. How about you, Hakima? Final thoughts on shared leadership, resources that help you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, on resources, I think some of the things that the women at Frida produce are always really inspiring and beautiful and great to read. So I would suggest people do look at those. Cindy, remind me of the name, the Movement Action Group.
I know, I was thinking and I can't remember. I know.
Maybe that's a link we can post later.
We can post the group later.
Yes.
But they produce, and we follow their blog, and they have a co-leadership model, and they've really inspired us as well with some of their learning. I think it's called MAG, but we forget. Despite there being two of us, we forget. There's a new question in the chat, and I guess it's the last one, but it asks, what can we advise newly organized groups, especially for young feminists? And I think it's really to chart the journey. As Cindy said, what's been wonderful for us is the collective journey, the journey of not just the two of us, but the whole AWID team, and how we're moving together in the same direction and around the political agenda. And we had to chart that journey for ourselves together of what that would look like. And it's going to look different for every group based on size. There are some people who are doing it, like Greenpeace is doing it with a huge organization. There are some people who are doing it with really small organizations. But however you're doing it, it's getting to know yourselves and really pinpointing what the political goal of this is, and of your movement and of your work, and then working to advance that.
Well, I want to say thank you to whoever asked that final question. Cindy, do you have thoughts to add to that?
Well, there's another question that came in. Do we have time, Nana?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So it's about, do you have any advice about how to collaborate with a board to explore the possibilities of co-director leadership? And I think that's a really important question. And of course, experiences vary quite a lot. As we said, in our case, the driving spirit, I think, behind this came from the outgoing ED and the board of directors. So there was a lot of support there. That's not always the case. And as I say, just from different conversations, I know it can sound scary to boards, like, who's going to report to us? If there's two, does that get confusing, perceiving the risks? But I think what's interesting is to see more and more feminist organizations who are investing and exploring this model. There is more research out there. We are working with folks, including some organization consultants, who are trying to document and make that publicly available. So I think there will be more resources that can help boards see how it can work and to weigh the advantages and challenges for themselves. The other thing that I think is, and the thought just went out of my mind. I'm hoping Hakima can finish my thought for me. But I think just for our board was very explicit in terms of, wanting to understand at the outset the division of labor and roles and responsibilities. And Hakeem and I were able to discuss and agree on that with us. And that gave the board, I think, some security, and then just like an ongoing regular touch points along the way. But I think the more resources and for boards to be able to see that it is doable can really help them get on board. And I remembered my thought by rambling so long. The transition was helpful. Like we had a long time, right? It wasn't rushed. Lydia had lots of conversation with the board. They weren't left like, oh my God, how do we fill this role in the next 3 months, right? It was a 2-year process. And so I think allowing that time, ensuring that the organization is in a relatively stable place can really help then the board take on different ways of doing things.
And just to add one small thing to what Cindy said, Lydia also worked with our donors and had conversations with them about the transition as well. And that was also super important to be able to establish that ground, that sustainable ground in which we could then experiment with this model.
Thank you so much both for sharing that. And I'm really glad that in the next week or two, we'll be able to share the documents that Lydia and our organizational consultant, Barbara, have worked on, documenting this transition, because I think that's the really important thing for us to do as feminist organizations as well, to also document our work, to share our work. So if you are not already a subscriber to the AWID newsletter, please visit our website, awid.org, and sign up to receive our newsletter so you can get updates about this transition document and all other relevant news from AWID. So Cindy, Hakima, thank you both so much for taking time to chat, for being so open, for being on this journey. And thank you to everybody who's been watching us live. Thank you to everybody who will watch this afterwards. Feel free to keep your questions and comments coming. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thanks, Nana. Bye-bye.